Well, I'd like to speak today about the role that aquatic pollutants are playing in oceans and fisheries in terms of their impacts on productivity. I want to thank, first of all, a couple of co-authors who made a great contribution to the publication from which I'm drawing most of the material from today's talk. So thanks to Joanna Imig and Marianne Lloyd-Smith, and also the editorial support team at IPEN for assisting. First of all, I'd just like to give a little sketch outline of how it is that our amazing oceans function to produce really quite immense amounts of food. So there is a lot of interaction happening between microscopic organisms all the way up the food web into larger fishes that are the dominant part of the fishery that we harvest from. So for understanding these interactions helps us appreciate where pollution may impact upon these, and then it gives us an opportunity to understand why some of the productivity of our oceans is declining. So the first part about how do you make fish is really about, we need to first make fish food, and to do that we need the sun. It's powering the provision of energy into the water. We add nutrients that are naturally occurring in our oceans and running off our landscape. They're captured by the plants, the microalgae, the seagrass, and corals all capture this energy and are actively producing what become fish food. So these are the foundations of the food web in our oceans. We then see the next step up of microscopic zooplankton eating these algae and bacteria and protozoa as well. And you can see here these microscopic organisms ingesting the algae and then fish larvae, the very first life stages, critically rely on these small zooplankton for their first meals. You can see the fish larvae have very large eyes and quite a large mouth compared to their body, so they can try and rapidly catch these small swimming food resources that they desperately need in their early days of life. There must be enough food present in enough density for the larvae to survive, and we know that with fish there are millions of larvae from spawning events. So we need very large loads of live feeds like rotifers and copepods in the water. So pre-industrialization, our aquatic food web broadly looked like this. So this is a schematic that I've utilized from a CSIRO publication. Broadly, we can see at the bottom, we have our bacteria and protozoa, our microalgae on top, our zooplankton, shellfish, shrimp and squid, and fish take up the position at the top of the food web. Now, when we overlay post-industrialization pollution, the food web looks quite impacted. Now the bacteria that are present, we have many different bacteria present in our waterways, and particularly our inshore waters that are most interfacing with the polluting inputs that we now make. So we see lots of different bacteria, more antibiotic resistant bacteria being present in our waterways. We see a dramatic reduction in our algae, seagrass and coral, particularly healthy algae that some of the oysters and our fishes and shrimp require. So we now see more toxic algal blooms than at any point in our history in humanity. So excess nutrient is driving these toxic algal blooms rather than healthy algae, which provides the fundamental food for the food web to be built upon. We see dramatic losses of seagrass due to excessive sediment, nutrient and herbicide, which I'll go into a little later. And we also see dramatic coral reef loss due to a complexity of impacts, including climate change and the warming of our oceans. So these changes are really quite significant on how it feeds into this aquatic food web. For the zooplankton, requirements are declining, and we see the myriad of pollutants, which we will talk about, and how these are impacting on the amount of zooplankton that is available. Subsequently, we see significant declines in our resources of shellfish, of shrimp and squid are also being impacted by a shortage of food resources as it works its way up the food web. Impacts like the sedimentation of shellfish beds or the impact of the water pollution in terms of pesticides and surfactants that are running into waterways are stressing our shellfish beds and increasing disease rates and mortality to very high levels now, in some areas completely removing the viability of those oyster beds. We see crustacea decline from the failure of recruitment. This term is a term about the number of new juvenile animals that successfully make their way into the population due to an impact in their earliest stages of life, or indeed in the parent brood stock, and how they can adequately form their gametes to reproduce. And what we get left with is a dramatic decline in fish quantity through this impact on reproductive success, this diminishment of food availability, the decline in the survival of juvenile fish, the loss of habitat, which the fish require to both live within and for it to produce their food. And so we see less and less fish production. Now, Bjorn mentioned that we see this great influx of pollution, and we know that it's really driven off gravity moving water downhill. We have no new water on planet Earth. Probably over the last 4.5 billion years, we've had the same water going around and around. It's being reused endlessly. It's falling as rain onto our landscapes and into our oceans. It's moving through groundwater back into our rivers and oceans, and then evaporating and moving through the cycle again. Now, there are many contributors that are combining to pollute the water sources that our aquatic food is trying to grow within our oceans. So things like microplastics, which have been a focus there early on, they are one of the categories. We have airborne pollutants coming out from coal-fired power stations, for example, including the greenhouse gases that are causing ocean warming, but also other pollutants, including arsenic and mercury. We see pharmaceutical pollution increasing as the volume of pharmaceuticals globally being produced increases. We know our wastewater systems are not presently filtering out all of these, and we do not have whole of life cycle management for pharmaceuticals. So we see elevating levels of many pharmaceuticals entering our inshore waterways and rivers, and they are impacting upon our aquatic life. We see agricultural chemicals being applied to many of our food systems. These chemicals do not stay where they're applied. They move and they enter waterways via rainfall and via groundwater entry. We see recreational areas like golf courses also having significant pesticide applications and then contaminating waterways. We see dramatic impacts from land clearing, where the loss of soil stability leads to very significant increases of sediment movement into waterways, having dire impacts, which we'll speak about. Some of our mining industries have quite poor control of leachate or their tailings dams, and we see failures in some of this infrastructure leading to very significant heavy metal pollution entering some of our waterways. We have firefighting foams and industrial chemicals, also a big class of poorly regulated compounds and insufficient control to stop them entering our waterways. And we know the levels of some of these compounds are continuing to rise, like the PFAS chemicals. And we've mentioned plastics, and I'll talk a little more about those as one of the more visible when they're large, but in fact, probably the bigger impacts for fish come from the microplastics and nanoplastics as they break down and become smaller. So I'd like to break it down into a few areas here to just demonstrate how some of these impacts from pollutants are being mediated and what we are seeing in the environment as a consequence. Excessive nutrients are being produced predominantly from agriculture through the production of fertilizer, which when applied to the landscape again does not stay where we place it, and we see an increasing amount moving into our waterways, rivers, and into our inshore ocean areas. The other significant contributor outside of agriculture is wastewater from human population, which continues to expand in size. Our wastewater systems and treatment systems vary between countries, but even amongst the best systems, there is still a significant amount of nutrient that escapes the system and is released to the environment. Long have we assumed that the solution to all of this pollution would be dilution. We hoped it would dilute low enough to not have an impact. But we now know that that is not the case. We have effectively run out of diluent. The levels that are now present in many waterways are causing harm to productivity. Blue-green algal blooms cause impacts within rivers and to animals and humans that need to drink those water resources. In the marine areas, we see mass mortality events from toxic algal blooms like red tides. At present in France, we have tremendous blooms of green algae washing up. In Turkey at present, we have a massive bloom of what's commonly referred to as sea snot accumulating around marinas and harbours, again from excessive nutrients. These are real problems and they have serious impacts on the bottom of the food web. We see this coursing over time to expand areas where we have oxygen dead zones. All of this nutrient drives bacterial proliferation. The bacteria themselves consume oxygen, and where there is insufficient oxygen being generated, the total oxygen level in water will decline. And that decline can reach a critical level for a whole range of the animals which we hope will be breeding and growing in our oceans. Concerningly, the size of these areas that are referred to as dead zones, where the oxygen level is very low, has been increasing substantially, and we're not seeing a signal that we are controlling this problem. So we're taking great areas out of productivity from our oceans, which is a significant concern, for it will only drive down the quantity of fish available to catch. Sediment pollution is very common and it has a significant negative effect on the productivity of aquatic environments. It comes about from clearing the landscape and having soil which is exposed and does not have plant roots, be they grasses or trees or a mixture of crops holding the soil together. The soils vary in how they may run off, but with rainfall, we see significant movements of sediment into our environment, causing off paddocks, out of rivers, and then spreading into the nearshore environments. This is my local town in Ballina, and you can see the very significant deterioration in water quality in that river, and we have lost a significant amount of productivity in our nearshore reefs, which previously produced more than 90% more fish than they do now. So we see very serious declines over relatively short timeframes of the last 40 to 50 years in this case. We also see wind erosion with rain moving soil. The impacts on fish can sometimes not be front of mind. Those little fish that we looked at earlier with big eyes and big mouths, their brains are quite small at that size, and they are tuned in to catching food. And they do so by trying to identify the food particles as being of the right size. Now, should the sediment particles be the right size, it's been shown that the fish will ingest those particles thinking they're getting a nutritious meal of zooplankton or algae. But in fact, they're getting a quite non-nutritious source of a sediment particle. This in turn leads to less growth and less survival in these small recruiting larvae. So we end up with less fish joining the ecosystem. The other thing that happens with sediment is it smothers habitat for fish. It smothers areas like seagrass, it smothers shellfish beds, covering up them or causing extra sediment on them to allow other pests to invade the shellfish. The sediment can settle on the shells of oysters, which then make it suitable for mudworm to colonize the oyster and can cause increased oyster mortality. The sediment also has a subtle effect of removing light from penetrating through the water, and we understand that our ocean productivity is intimately linked to the penetration of that sunlight, that foundational step of directing energy into the water. We know along the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia, we have seagrass meadows in very clear water that can be at depths of up to 70 metres underneath the ocean surface, where the water is very clear. However, where we see increases in sedimentation and the turbidity of the water, we no longer can support enough light to support the seagrass to be viable. So we see declines. And it also fills in critical deep water fish habitat. Some of the native fish in Australia require rocky caves to perform their spawning activities in for reproduction. Without them, they simply don't spawn and don't have viable population coming through. Pharmaceuticals are a growing concern in our aquatic environment. They come from many areas, including the pharmacy provided to humans, but also the pharmacy provided to animals. I'm a veterinarian, so I fit into the animal providing basket of using pharmaceuticals. Concerningly for me, most of the products which I use have not been regulated and approved in thinking about where will they end up after they treat the animal for the various problems that it may have. Presently, we don't have a full life cycle regulation of pharmaceuticals, and so we see them ending up in places where they were never intended to be, like in our waterways and entering our aquatic food webs. When I say we think we know, we actually know for sure. This is a list of pharmaceutical products in a river in Melbourne that were identified. With our advancing technology for chemical testing, we can now see where, in fact, these products are ending up, and they're ending up in our waterways. When they land there, we create quite the cocktail effect, which is then having impacts on the developing larvae that are trying to incubate in these watercourses. And we see very clear impacts on the sediment-dwelling organisms that are trying to keep the benthos or the sediments of the waterways healthy and provide food resources. And the net impact is a decline in productivity and in health. Some very useful experiments have been done by scientists around the world to illustrate the problems that come with wastewater. This particular experiment looked at the effect of estrogens that can come out in wastewater. They took a lake in the middle of Canada and they infused into the lake 5 parts per trillion. So a frighteningly small quantity of estrogen was put into the lake to see what would happen to this population and to the entire ecology of the lake. It was very concerning, and within 3 years, they saw substantial shifts in ecology in the lake. Right through the food web, interestingly, this interconnectedness of things means that there are what might be referred to as domino effects, whereby losing the short breeding fast fish, which became feminized and their breeding became unsuccessful, they then were a predator on some of the algae in the population in the lake. And so some of the plankton then became completely out of balance. And we saw further knock-on toxic effects in the population. The phenomenon of impacting on reproduction and on impacting on hormones is a common thread in how some of the toxic chemicals that are entering our waterways impact on fish. We refer to this as endocrine disruption, where we can see impacts on the gender of fish. This is an intersex fish here. You can see an ovary with testis within the ovary. So we see an impact where we are creating an intersex fish which do not are not as fertile and do not produce nearly the numbers of healthy larvae. There are many chemicals which are not removed from wastewater that influence this problem. Agricultural and veterinary chemicals, so broadly we classify these as pesticides, can have effects on fish at sizes that we don't see. This is a micrograph of a fish larvae, and you're able to see in the area where the heart of the animal is that it's quite swollen, and this swelling, we call it cardiac edema, is a consequence of being exposed to hydrocarbons or to some pesticides. We see impacts on the health of the heart of very early larvae. And these larvae then often fail to survive to develop through into fish. This particular case, you can see that we did some pathology on the animal and we identified the problems through that. So hyperextension of the cardiac area of the heart. Experimentally, we see very similar impacts in experimental fish. So we have a sound understanding that very low exposures to pesticides in our waterways impacts on fish development and has a negative effect on the numbers of fish coming through. One of the newer classes of insecticide are called the neonicotinoid insecticides. They're commonly known on land to cause problems with honeybees, so much so that the EU has removed all of the outdoor uses of this class of insecticide due to their impacts on the pollinating invertebrates like honeybees that are essential for much of our food. However, elsewhere in the world, widespread aquatic contamination continues to occur, including in Australia. We see from survey work in Australia by CSIRO at these various sites down our coastline that there are increasing levels of this particular neonicotinoid called imidacloprid. What's concerning is that in some areas, we know that the levels present are enough to stop the animals eating properly. So we see a reduction in the growth and the survival because the larvae don't eat. In Japan, this has also been shown to impact fish further up the food web. So whilst the fish themselves are not that sensitive to neonicotinoids, their food is. And what they showed in this Japanese study is that the decline in fish food available led to a decrease in the fishery yield downstream of areas where these chemicals were used in rice paddies. Wastewater is another perhaps lesser understood or less appreciated source of insecticides. One of the US studies showed that in fact we have significant levels of these chemicals coming through wastewater as well, and that the systems are not removing them and capturing them before the release of wastewater. Another class of chemicals are the industrial chemicals, which we have various places for them being released and moving from factory areas through stormwater or industrial pipe releases into sewage or releases into the air, which subsequently return to Earth with rain and impact on the fish. This is a particularly interesting study that highlights this effect on the functioning of the genes of the fish. So they're altering the way in which the genome of the fish is being read. This is called an epigenetic change. In this study, they exposed the fish to persistent organic pollutants. These are extremely long-lasting pollutants, things like PCBs and dioxins and PFAS chemicals. And what they showed was that fish which were exposed when given the same diet increased their body weight. It changed the timing at which they became reproductively active, and it made a number of changes in relation to hormones, causing endocrine disruption. We know similarly that the firefighting chemicals, which are also present in non-stick coatings on pans and in food packaging like pizza boxes or in other fast food packaging that have non-stick coatings. These chemicals we know in the development of fish, again in the microscopic early life stages. It affects organ development, it affects the development of the immune system and the behavior of those animals subsequently, where they may no longer exhibit the behaviors required to reproduce or to protect their nest when the animals may be reproducing. We know the chemicals can pass from the fish into ourselves, and we know now also that they're being linked to worse outcomes in people who get infected by the COVID coronavirus. Plastics are another component pollutant that is now in our marine resource area, and the way in which they cause toxicity to fisheries can be twofold. We know now that plastics, when they're first made, may have some toxic plasticizers included in them. Compounds such as BPA and phthalates are well described now to have toxic impacts on fishery biota as they are on humans, causing endocrine disruption. However, we know that there's an effect also by simply the particles acting as feed, much like the sediment I mentioned earlier. The particles of plastic, if they're the right size, do get ingested by zooplankton, and you can see both early life stage mollusks, so this is a small shellfish larvae, small zooplankton copepods, and a small shrimp, all ate what were fluorescent labeled plastic beads. And instead of eating food, the plastic again slows the growth and it diminishes the amount of food available at the bottom of the food web. One final one I wish to touch on is the excess heat, both from climate change through the burning of fossil fuels, the production of carbon dioxide and methane. These are driving heat into our oceans, and we know that that heat has a negative effect. Indeed, some of the forecasts are that we will see a very substantial reduction in productivity in our marine areas simply due to heat, not even considering the myriad other pollutants we've talked about today. One of the sources of heat in some countries is from nuclear power plants also. The cooling water provides a very substantial input of heat. We know in our coral areas that this heat is driving coral bleaching. We've had very significant bleaching events here in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef due to higher water temperatures. But we know also that the other pollutants like nutrients and pesticides, they actually lower the tolerance of coral to temperature. So these things add together as a cumulative stress. So sadly, the net effects of pollution are that we see our inshore fisheries and riverine fisheries in decline due to reducing healthy food resources, impaired fish reproduction, and degrading habitat.